So I have to admit that when I was planning out these lecture videos, I went back and forth in my head between describing everything in chronological order or by topic. So for the most part, right or wrong, I decided to tell the story by topic. So you just watched my last two videos, the one about the browser wars, that was lecture 6, and the one after that about standards, lecture 7. But from a timeline standpoint, they mostly overlap because they were both kind of took place pretty much from the early 1990s to the early 2000s. And that's because in my mind, it almost felt like telling two completely different stories. So on one hand, we got the commercial-based web kicked off by Mark Andreessen and the Netscape Navigator web browser. And that's what spiraled into the browser wars, where companies battled for dominance. As companies around the world, they woke up to the market potential of the World Wide Web. But on the other hand, we got the story about the W3C, and that was kicked off by Tim Berners-Lee in an attempt to rein in the fragmentation of the web as it evolved from a research and academic tool to a commercial platform. So at this point, let's take a moment to kind of connect the dots. I want to explain just how much the pressure to commercialize the web drove the W3C to broaden its focus from just maintaining a document-based information system to a market-driven platform that had focus on richer design, layout, and styling needs. So remember, when Tim Berners-Lee first imagined the web, his goal was to make it easier for researchers to share information. The publisher, in his mind, was someone uploading documentation or writing about a technical topic, not someone designing marketing pages for crafting some visual experience for their company. So the architecture TBL design reflected that. Finding information was, handled by standard addressing, URLs. And connecting information was handled by linking hypertext embedded in the HTML. And styling? Well, that was meant to be the browser's job. The browser would simply render each element, like headings, paragraphs, links, and using a set of built-in default styles, there would be no fuss, no design tools, and no time spent by the researcher on formatting or making their document look, God forbid, pretty. Even so, Tim Berners-Lee wasn't immune to small compromises here and there, because early HTML included presentational tags like B for bold and I for italic. They were minor, but they blurred the line between content and appearance right from the start. But that line didn't stay blurry because it actually got worse. It really got muddled up. Once the web really took off commercially, people wanted far more control about how their pages looked. So branding, visual storytelling, and polished design really started to matter a lot, especially in marketing and corporate communications. Back in the mid-1990s, I was working in marketing. Like others in that space, we brought our habits from the print world. So we drew inspiration from things like product brochures and product collateral, and that included multi-column layouts, meaningful typography, and design elements that we borrowed from the graphic arts industry, like hero images and lead paragraphs, and most importantly, a consistent visual identity across multiple pages like you'd expect in a printed brochure. But none of that was built into the web's original technology. But that's what we wanted the web to do, so companies like Netscape and Microsoft were more than happy to support that vision. Unfortunately, each in their own proprietary way. So yeah, even though we talked about it before, but now you know why. Why the browser makers started adding their own tools. The IMG tag let us place images in line with text, and then came the font tag, which allowed authors to change typefaces and colors right inside the HTML. Netscape gave us the blink tag. Microsoft gave us the marquee tag. And before long, markup meant more than defining structure. It was polluted with presentation and style. And that is what made web pages harder to maintain for us developers, harder to standardize, and harder to make accessible. And that is why the W3C stepped in. The W3C realized that if the web was going to grow, especially with commercial and international adoption, that they would need a better way to control how things looked without compromising the structure of the content. And that idea, drawn from the software engineering principle called separation of concerns, was the foundation for a brand new technology that I mentioned in the last lecture. And they called it cascading style sheets, or CSS. And by the way, the term style sheets was also borrowed from the print industry, where it referred to standardized layout and formatting instructions that was used in the publishing industry, which was another sign that the web was kind of starting to evolve to meet the visual expectations of a world used to printed media. Anyway, the idea of CSS was simple, that HTML would define the structure and meaning of the content, and CSS would define how the content looked. So colors, fonts, spacing, alignment, all of those presentation details would live in a separate layer, one that could be reused, managed more easily, and applied consistently across all web browsers, or at least all standard compliant web browsers. So just to tie it all together, as I mentioned in the last lecture, while the browser wars were heating up, the W3C launched the CSS Working Group and published the first official recommendation, CSS-1, in 1996. It was basic, but it gave the developers the first standardized way to style web pages without stuffing the HTML full of visual instructions. And that was the first major step towards the web that we know today, where structure, presentation, and later the behavior layer, which we'll talk about later with JavaScript, would all have their own distinct roles.